Every pattern you repeat or every choice you can't explain and every version of yourself you keep returning to has a blueprint. Welcome to the Echo Principle, where we map the unseen architecture of human behavior. If you think carefully, you belong here, so drop a like and make sure to subscribe to our channel. In 1974, the United States government made seatbelts mandatory in every new car sold in the country. It was a straightforward decision backed by straightforward logic. Seatbelts save lives in crashes. Therefore, more seatbelts means fewer deaths. The math seemed obvious and the policy seemed inevitable. A year later, an economist named Sam Peltzman published a study that stopped everyone cold. Peltzman had done something that almost nobody thought to do before implementing the policy. He looked at what actually happened to traffic fatalities after the safety regulations came in. Not what should have happened according to the model. What actually happened. And what he found was that the fatalities among car occupants did decrease, roughly as predicted. But fatalities among pedestrians and cyclists increased. And the overall death toll from traffic accidents remained almost exactly the same as before. The seatbelts were working. The cars were safer. And people were dying at the same rate. This was not a data error. It was not a statistical artifact. It was the first rigorous documentation of something that had been observed informally for decades but never properly mapped. That human beings do not simply absorb safety improvements and become safer. They absorb safety improvements and recalibrate their behavior to maintain a roughly constant level of perceived risk. Make the car safer and the driver pushes a little harder. Install the airbag and the following distance shrinks. Add the safety net and the tightrope walker moves a little faster. Peltzman called it risk compensation. We now call it the Peltzman Effect. And once you see it, you cannot stop seeing it everywhere. To understand why this happens, you have to understand what fear is actually for. Fear is not a malfunction. It is not weakness. It is one of the most sophisticated risk management systems ever produced by evolution. And its primary organ is a small almond-shaped structure deep in the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala is the brain's threat detection center. It processes incoming information for danger faster than the conscious mind can follow, triggering physiological responses that prepare the body to fight, flee, or freeze before rational thought has had a chance to evaluate the situation. But the amygdala is not just a smoke alarm. It is a calibration system. It continuously assesses the level of threat present in the environment and modulates behavior accordingly. When the perceived threat level is high, behavior becomes more cautious. When the perceived threat level drops, the amygdala releases that caution and behavior becomes more expansive. This is the mechanism that Peltzman accidentally documented in traffic data. The seatbelt does not just protect the body in a crash. It signals to the amygdala that the threat level has decreased. And the amygdala, receiving that signal, releases some of the caution it had been applying to driving behavior. The driver does not consciously decide to drive faster. The recalibration happens below the level of conscious decision-making, in the same automatic way that the original caution was applied. This is not irrationality. It is the risk management system functioning exactly as designed. The problem is that the system was calibrated for an environment where the relationship between perceived safety and actual safety was much more reliable than it is in the modern world. Gerald Wilde, a psychologist at Queen's University in Canada, developed the most complete theoretical framework for this phenomenon in the 1980s. He called it risk homeostasis. The idea that every person carries an internal target level of risk, a set point, and that behavior continuously adjusts to maintain that set point regardless of changes in the external environment. Wilde's framework made a prediction that seemed almost deliberately provocative. That safety interventions which reduce the objective danger of an activity without changing the individual's target risk level will produce compensatory behavior that restores the original level of risk. And that the only interventions that actually reduce accidents long-term are the ones that change the target risk level itself. The ones that make people want to be safer, not just the ones that make their environment safer. The distinction sounds subtle. It is actually enormous. Consider two approaches to reducing drunk driving fatalities. The first approach makes cars safer so that crashes are more survivable. The second approach changes the social norm around drunk driving so that the behavior becomes genuinely unacceptable rather than merely illegal. Wilde's framework predicts that the first approach will produce risk compensation. That drivers who feel protected will recalibrate their behavior in ways that partially or fully offset the safety gain. And that the second approach, by actually shifting the target risk level, will produce durable behavioral change. The data on drunk driving fatalities over the past 40 years broadly supports this prediction. The steepest declines in drunk driving deaths correlate not with car safety improvements but with cultural shifts in how the behavior is perceived. With the normalization of designated drivers. With the social stigma that campaigns like Mothers Against Drunk Driving help to establish. With a genuine change in what people wanted to do, not just what they were equipped to survive. The Peltzman effect shows up in places that have nothing to do with cars or roads, and that makes it considerably more interesting and considerably more uncomfortable. In the financial sector, the introduction of deposit insurance in the United States in the 1930s was designed to prevent bank runs. The logic was straightforward. If depositors know their money is guaranteed, they will not panic and withdraw everything at the first sign of trouble. Which is true. Bank runs became rare. But what also happened is that banks, knowing their depositors were insulated from the consequences of bank failure, began taking on more risk. The safety net for depositors became a license for risk-taking by the institutions that managed their money. This dynamic, which economists call moral hazard, is the Peltzman effect applied to institutional behavior. When the consequences of failure are absorbed by a third party, the incentive to avoid failure is weakened. And the behavior that follows reflects that weakened incentive. The 2008 financial crisis is the most spectacular modern example of this mechanism operating at scale. Financial institutions that were considered too big to fail operated with the implicit assumption that catastrophic failure would be absorbed by the government and ultimately by taxpayers. That assumption was not wrong. And the behavior it generated, the extraordinary risk appetite, the leveraged positions, the instruments that concealed risk rather than eliminating it, was the rational response to a safety structure that had been designed without accounting for the behavioral response it would produce. Peltzman's insight, developed from traffic fatality data in 1975, had described precisely what would happen in 2008. Nobody in the regulatory framework was listening closely enough. In medicine, the Peltzman effect appears in a pattern that has been documented across multiple conditions and multiple decades. The introduction of effective treatment for a disease consistently produces some degree of behavioral change that increases exposure to that disease. When highly effective antiretroviral therapy for HIV became widely available in the mid-1990s, infection rates among some populations did not continue their downward trend. In some demographics they increased. Because the perception of HIV as a death sentence had been one of the most powerful behavioral regulators available. When that perception changed, when the disease became manageable rather than terminal, the behavioral constraint it had generated was partially released. The same pattern appeared with the introduction of PrEP, the highly effective HIV prevention medication. Studies showed that some PrEP users reduced their use of other protective behaviors after starting the medication. Not because they were making a calculated decision to abandon protection, but because the perceived threat level had dropped and the amygdala had adjusted accordingly. This is not an argument against antiretroviral therapy or PrEP. The net health outcomes from both interventions are enormously positive. But it is an illustration of why the behavioral response to safety improvements must be incorporated into any honest assessment of their effects. And why public health messaging that introduces a new safety measure without accounting for the behavioral recalibration it will produce is systematically underestimating the challenge it is addressing. The safety measure changes the environment. The brain changes the behavior. And the interaction between those two changes is where the actual outcome lives. There is a version of the Peltzman effect that operates not at the societal level but inside the architecture of individual lives. And it is the version that most people recognize, uncomfortably, when they look at their own history honestly. Think about the last time you implemented a safety measure in your own life. A financial buffer that made you feel secure enough to take a professional risk you would not otherwise have taken. A relationship that made you feel stable enough to stop maintaining the social connections you had previously cultivated out of necessity. A health intervention that made you feel protected enough to relax the habits that had generated the need for the intervention in the first place. None of these recalibrations are conscious. None of them feel like decisions. They feel like the natural relaxation that follows the relief of pressure. Like the exhale after tension is released. And in many cases they are entirely reasonable. The point of building a financial buffer is partly to enable risk-taking that the absence of a buffer would prevent. But the mechanism has a shadow side. The person who quit smoking and gains weight because the health anxiety that regulated their eating was also being managed by the nicotine. The person who resolves a relationship conflict and stops going to therapy because the acute pain that drove them there has been relieved. The person who achieves financial stability and stops developing the professional skills that generated it because the scarcity that motivated the development is gone. Gerald Wilde's framework predicts these patterns precisely. The target risk level has not changed. The safety measure has changed the perception of the current risk level. And behavior adjusts to restore the gap. The most counterintuitive finding that emerges from the risk compensation literature is the one that Wilde himself found most provocative. That some of the most effective safety interventions ever documented are not safety measures at all. They are deliberate increases in perceived risk. The most cited example is the naked street. A traffic engineering concept developed by Hans Mondeman, a Dutch traffic engineer, in the 1980s. Mondeman's insight was that conventional traffic safety infrastructure, the barriers, the signs, the painted lanes, the signals, all the apparatus designed to protect road users from each other, was producing precisely the risk compensation effect Peltzman had documented. Drivers inside a heavily regulated environment felt protected and drove accordingly. They stopped making eye contact with pedestrians. They stopped attending to the full complexity of the environment. They outsourced their attention to the infrastructure. Mondeman removed the infrastructure. He created intersections with no signals, no lane markings, no curbs separating pedestrians from vehicles. What he called shared space. And what happened in the places where this was implemented was not the catastrophe that common sense predicted. Accident rates dropped dramatically because drivers entering an environment with no safety infrastructure were forced to attend fully, to make eye contact, to negotiate with pedestrians and cyclists in real time, to drive with the care and caution that the amygdala generates when the perceived threat level is appropriately calibrated. The absence of safety made people safer, not because safety is bad, but because the perception of safety had been producing its own specific form of danger. There is a dimension of this that extends beyond behavior and into something more fundamental about how human beings relate to risk psychologically. Nassim Taleb, in his work on Antifragility, makes a distinction that maps precisely onto the Peltzman framework. Between things that are fragile, which break under stress, things that are robust, which resist stress, and things that are antifragile, which actually improve under stress. And his central argument is that the modern project of eliminating risk and volatility from systems, whether financial systems or biological systems or human psychological systems, consistently produces fragility rather than safety. Because systems that are never stressed do not develop the adaptive capacity to handle stress when it arrives. The immune system that is never challenged does not develop robust defenses. The financial system that is never allowed to fail does not develop the discipline that the possibility of failure generates. The person who is never allowed to experience the consequences of their own risk-taking does not develop the calibration that genuine experience of consequence provides. The Peltzman Effect is one expression of this deeper principle. When you remove the consequence from a behavior, you remove the primary mechanism through which the brain learns to calibrate that behavior appropriately. The fear that the amygdala generates in response to genuine perceived risk is not just unpleasant. It is information. It is the system working. And when you muffle that signal with a safety measure that reduces perceived risk without proportionally reducing actual risk, you are not just changing behavior in the short term. You are degrading the calibration system itself. So what does an honest account of the Peltzman effect recommend? Because the answer is not to remove seatbelts or eliminate deposit insurance or abandon antiretroviral therapy. The interventions are net positive. The question is how to design them and how to think about them in a way that accounts for the behavioral response they will generate. The first principle that emerges from the research is transparency about the mechanism. People who understand that safety measures produce risk compensation are measurably better at resisting that compensation. Not perfectly. The amygdala does not respond to intellectual understanding the way it responds to perceived threat. But awareness creates a gap between the automatic recalibration and the behavior that follows it. And in that gap, some degree of conscious correction becomes possible. The second principle is designing safety measures that preserve rather than muffle the fear signal. The shared space traffic design is the clearest example. But the principle applies more broadly. Safety systems that keep the perceived risk appropriately calibrated, that protect against catastrophic outcomes while preserving the behavioral engagement that genuine perceived risk generates, consistently outperform systems that simply absorb the consequences of recklessness. The third principle is Wilde's most fundamental insight. That the only durable path to reduce risk is changing the target risk level. Changing what people actually want to do. Which means changing culture, changing norms, changing the social meaning of the behavior, not just changing the physical consequences of it. This is harder, slower, and less satisfying than installing a safety feature. But it is the intervention that actually moves the set point rather than just temporarily obscuring it. Here is the closing thought. The Peltzman effect is uncomfortable because it implicates something we would prefer not to examine too closely. The relationship between safety and behavior is not additive. You cannot simply stack safety measures on top of existing behavior and expect the behavior to remain unchanged. The behavior is part of the system. It responds to the safety measure. And the response is often precisely the one that partially or fully offsets the safety gain. This does not mean safety measures are futile. It means they are more complex than the models that produce them typically account for. It means that the question to ask about any safety intervention is not just does it reduce the objective danger, but what behavioral response will it generate and how does that response interact with the original danger? Sam Peltzman asked that question about seatbelts in 1975 and produced a finding that the field of traffic safety did not fully integrate for decades. Because the finding was uncomfortable. Because it complicated a simple story. Because it suggested that the relationship between human beings and risk is not a problem to be engineered away but a dynamic to be understood and worked with. Every time you feel the relaxation that follows a safety measure, the slight release of caution, the subtle expansion of behavior, that is the Peltzman effect making itself felt in the most immediate possible way. In your own nervous system. In the gap between perceived safety and actual safety that the amygdala is continuously, automatically, and without your permission, trying to close. You are not broken for responding this way. You are running exactly the risk management system that kept your ancestors alive. The question is whether you can see it clearly enough to decide when to follow it and when to override it. That distinction, made consciously, is the only thing standing between the safety measure and the behavior it was designed to prevent. This has been the Echo Principle. Drop a like if you enjoyed, and make sure to subscribe to our channel. Take care and enjoy life.